Okay, well, thank you everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining our digital stakeholder engagement webinar for healthcare companies in Latin America. It is really a pleasure to be here today. For those who do not know me, my name is Maciel Núñez and I'm a senior manager from client services at FrontierView. I recognize that some of you might be new to us. Hence, I will spend the next couple of minutes providing you with a very brief overview of our firm and how we work with executives across major multinational companies. FrontierView is a global market intelligence and advisory firm focused on providing tailored solutions to power strategic objectives, strategic planning, market monitoring, and international growth for companies across the healthcare, B2B, consumer, and technology sector. Our teams, which are based literally across the world in Europe, Asia Pacific, North America, Middle East, etc., you name it. We serve as advisors and trusted partners to over 4,000 executives across over 200 multinational companies that we work with. And for us, it's about delivering the market and industry knowledge that our clients need to succeed in all points of the business cycle. We do this through a very strategic and very unique market intelligence and through a very unique service model. So I invite all of you to learn more about us. You can do so through our website, FrontierView.com. Also, I would love to invite you, and I'm very excited about this one, to invite you to learn more about us through our FrontierView mobile app, which has been created and has been recently launched for all of you. This has been really directed for global executives such as yourself, so you can have real-time direct access to curated news, market intelligence, and experts analysis on business implications. So you can do so. You can download it through the App Store or through Google Play, and we're very excited about this initiative. So with that in mind, I would like to provide now the opportunity to introduce you to our very own presenter, Martina Bosayeva, who is the head of global research. Martina, thank you so much for being here with us. We're super excited about the agenda that you have prepared for us.
Thank you very much, Maciel. It's great to have everybody on the line as well. Thanks for joining.
Fantastic. So, so today the webinar will take a little bit talking about the structure. It's 1 hour long, and we will discuss between the first 45 to 50 minutes is going to be a moderated discussion, and then the rest of the remaining minutes, about 10 minutes, will be a Q&A session. So as you might have read, our focus today it's about the digital engagement. So we have seen how COVID has accelerated tremendously that digital transformation we had already seen happening, and this has forced companies, right, to rely on digital tools to really engage with the different customers, the different stakeholders. So our intention today is really to provide you with case studies, ideas, insights on how companies are utilizing the digital marketing tools. What are some of the methods they're using? What are some of the approaches they're utilizing to really continue to engage? We will also be talking a little bit about how to find, and this is a really hard question, right? How to define that offline and online balance on the digital tools in a post-COVID world. So Martina's going to talk a little bit more about that and through the session today. But two things that I want to add before we get started. First, we want this to be as engaging as possible. So through the session, we will be interacting with you via polling. So you will receive some questions that will show up in your screen, and you will be able to have the possibility to just click on the answer. And we will guide you through it as we go through the conversation. And second, if you do have any questions for us, if you have any concerns, please feel free to send us your questions. You can do so on the right corner of your screen. You're going to see the option, the Q&A option or the chat option, and we will try our best to answer them as we get to the Q&A session. So with that, I pass the word to you, Martina. I know there's a lot to cover, so the word is all yours.
Great, thank you very much, Maciel. Probably the most important way for us to start is to define our terms a little bit, because we know that digital is a massive topic that has tons of different manifestations across organizations as they pursue transformation across a lot of their activities using digital tools. And so for us today, it's important to be specific about what are we actually talking about, and then look at the implications and the implementation of it. And when we think about different components of how digitalization can manifest, some of it is about optimizing processes and bringing digital tools to support those. There's a component which is around people management, and there's also a component which is around stakeholder engagement and customer engagement. And this is where we see two elements really playing out. One is around digital solutions, which are enabling stakeholder support or are helping companies get more value or give their customers more value from existing products, or innovating on top of products that are already there. This is not going to be the focus of our conversation today, although we acknowledge that there's a whole series of big important monetization, commercialization, go-to-market questions associated with digital healthcare solutions. If that's a topic you're interested in, we do have research on it, and let us know, drop us a note in the chat function, and we can follow up with you afterwards. But where the focus of today's conversation will be, especially in the context of COVID-19, is on the right-hand side, which is on the digital marketing side. And so in particular, how do we use digital tools in a very unique healthcare space and the context of what's possible with healthcare stakeholders to engage, to influence, to advocate with stakeholders using digital tools. And what we know is that COVID-19 has disrupted a number of traditional ways of engaging with stakeholders in the healthcare space across LATAM and really across the world. Some of these challenges are really not unique to the region. And it has done a few things that have been practical in the way that they have disrupted how companies operate. As you can see here, we've got 4 broad areas. I will quickly give you a sense of how each one has played out, and we'll give you some examples of what companies have been doing, but also what does the future look like post-COVID for some of these approaches. If we start first with the inability to send sales reps into hospitals and physicians' offices to maintain relationships, or especially to start new relationships with new stakeholders, this has been a challenge that a lot of companies have had to deal with, especially given the implications that COVID-19 has had in terms of hospital staffing, in terms of what HCPs have been involved in terms of lack of access to healthcare facilities for most individuals. And therefore, we've seen a lot of companies that have tried to move this to an online engagement approach, holding meetings via teleconferencing tools, whether it is video chat or calls or otherwise, being much more flexible in terms of when they reach out to stakeholders, and then also using social media and KOLs, as well as other types of content marketing to create engagement points. And in some ways, we've heard them saying that some stakeholders have actually had more time to engage online because of the disruption with COVID, because they're home, because they're not traveling, or they might not be on the ground and tied up with other activities. But ultimately, there are questions around what happens after we see normalization in terms of access to hospital, access to HCPs, when they go back to being physically present with patients. Will they still want to engage online, or would they much rather prefer to meet in person? How much of those old habits are likely to stick, and how many of them are likely to go straight back to where they used to be? What we've also seen, especially because the crisis has lasted now for a while, is an overwhelming amount of webinars, phone calls, all sorts of digital engagement, way beyond anything that just companies are doing, but just so much of the activity has moved to online that there is a certain amount of exhaustion coming with this, which makes these types of outreach tools less effective. So how do we deal with that? As well as the complexity when you have third parties trying to engage with it, who may not have the expertise or the tools or the skill sets within their organizations to really be very efficient and effective in doing this. So in theory, it works. It is not always smooth, but it has been a really big drastic change in terms of how companies have gone about using straightforward engagement tools. I know, Maciel, you have also had conversations with clients about how they have approached this in LATAM. Are there any anecdotes or other examples you would bring to the conversation of what you've heard from companies?
Yes, Martina, a few things come to mind, and I think to your point, this has represented a little bit of challenges and opportunities, right, for companies to have to be more creative. Something that a couple of that come to mind is precisely what you mentioned about capturing attention, right? So where at the beginning, yes, it's very easy. You're from home taking the calls, but then exactly what you mentioned, right? There's a saturation where physicians, doctors, etc., different stakeholders are used saturated and overwhelmed by so much information that it's becoming really challenging to capture their attention and to keep them engaged. And it also has made it a lot much easier to reject some sales calls and it's made it much more difficult to get in front of these clients of the sales force. So the other couple that I have is one is a little bit more in opportunities and a shift. For instance, I'm talking about that shift on the capabilities of the workforce. For instance, we have seen, obviously the workforce we have sales people that have had many success for decades, for years, that are experts at selling, but then having a digital tool, this is something that might be new. So those capabilities are shifting, and some of our clients are seeing a newer generation, perhaps not as experienced, obtaining some success. Obviously, this is not for everyone, but for some people have seen more success with these new digital tools. And then perhaps the last one that I can share, just to pass the word back to you, is talking about how to, now it's from the sales force, how do you keep the sales force engaged? Because a big challenge is a lot of times the workforce feeds on that adrenaline of sales, of they feed on that social interaction. So not having that can incrementally impact the workforce effectiveness. So how do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them with that same energy, with that same ideas to continue to sell through an also preferred digital social engagement? So those are three that come to mind, but I'll pass the word back to you so you can continue sharing some other areas with us.
These are all very consistent, and in fact, again, not only in LATAM, so there's some global consistency to these challenges as well. And we will come back to these topics actually, because while we're talking today, right now, about what COVID has done and how companies have responded, what we really want to get to is long-term. What does this look like, and how do we think about it? So we will revisit the question of the stakeholder journey and preferences, and also the talent question as we continue in our conversation. But these are all very relevant examples. So if we continue with the elements of disruption and how companies have adjusted to them in engaging with their stakeholders, one of the very basic, obvious things that has been disrupted have been conferences and other in-person events. Straightforward enough now that we are 6-9 months into this crisis. A lot of conferences, of course, have gone online. Some clients, and you'll see some testimonials in a moment, actually have been quite happy with how those have gone from their perspective. There are really big questions about what is the future of conferences, and is that some kind of hybrid between online and offline? And what are the right ways to think about both resource allocation for conference attendance or organization? If you think about marketing budgets going into the world post-COVID, and also is there something lost when you're doing things online in terms of some of the networking and some of the accidental encounters that can be so valuable in in-person events? So a lot of companies trying to find the right balance between those two, but certainly much more open-minded now than they have been before to the idea of organizing and also attending online conferences. And then if we look at questions around stakeholders not being available, so one of the things we've seen, especially with HCPs, to some extent with also regulators, is the fact that they've been busy dealing with COVID itself, and therefore have been not available even through online tools to engage. They may have been burned out. They may have had significant pressure on them, making them much less accessible regardless of the tools. And as a result, we have seen innovation in terms of companies creating content that stakeholders can use and consume on their own time, on their own schedule, without having to have that specific moment that is committed to that specific engagement. So lots of innovation in terms of recording trainings, running recorded webinars that can then be distributed more broadly, looking for different ways to create valuable content, sometimes even on topics that maybe go outside of the core focus of the firm, but are value additive to the stakeholders themselves. And then looking for ways to distribute these through social media, through other types of platforms. We'll come back to questions about how companies are doing this in terms of the channel split, but this has clearly been an area of innovation that companies have engaged in. And then the fourth component, also COVID related, has been the inability to run demonstrations and trainings, really important in the medical device space, but not only. And this is where we've seen tools like virtual reality, recordings, etc., really starting to come into their own and really pushing companies out of their comfort zone in terms of using these tools to simulate what otherwise would naturally have been an in-person session. And I'll share in a moment a few testimonials in terms of what this might look like and how companies have used it. But this has been a real source of experimentation for companies. Feedback-wise, we're hearing that some ACPs, for example, are really interested and open to this kind of engagement, and actually it's more efficient for them and for the multinational. In other cases, of course, there's only so much you can do virtually as opposed to in person, but it's likely that some of these tools will probably come into some hybrid mode post-COVID and will be used in specific occasions where they're actually the most efficient ways of generating the content, or maybe bringing together individuals that otherwise would be hard to physically bring in one place, while expanding the total audience as well. So again, we've been pushed to innovate with things that were maybe out there on our radar, but not really a really high priority, and really forced to learn how to use them in a range of ways. Basil, have you heard about any other examples in this area that are coming from our clients in LATAM?
Yes, I have, Martina, and they're very aligned with what you're saying, and mainly raising the question of where does that balance, where do we find that balance of hybrid? Because yes, as we see more tools being developed for this type of solution, hopefully we can find that right online versus offline interaction. But so far, what I've heard is that it's being extremely challenging because many companies, particularly MMD, dealing with capital equipment, they need to have two areas. One, the demonstration of the product, which is extremely challenging to imagine through this computer screen, and second, that value added, right? That service step. How do you guide them through that? So it's become very challenging. Again, that lead us to some of the questions you posed. What is that balance? Some of this we're going to talk about today.
That's great. Yeah, and just to provide a little bit more voice of the market of individuals we have spoken with, this has been anonymized, but is based on client feedback and interactions. Here's an example of a company that was actually trying to deal with this specific question, which was they have an innovative medical device, which does require quite a lot of training because it is a new procedure, especially in markets where they're just introducing it. And so what they shared with us is that they've used Microsoft Teams to run educational sessions, and then they also videotape discussions with KOL. So this is marketing as content creation as value addition. And these were not necessarily on their device or the therapy area. They were just more broad ideas trying to engage stakeholders on questions that they assumed would be really high and top of mind for a lot of them. And their conclusion, at least with the stakeholder that we spoke with, was that they expect to remain in this hybrid mode. They're probably going to be doing some mix of in-person and online interactive engagements and trainings in particular. That has implications for travel budgets. But at the same time, there are limits to it. And he was very clear that he acknowledges that there will be areas, groups of stakeholders, key markets where they will continue to invest. But the option of doing this online is on the table, credible and tested. At this point, giving them more flexibility in terms of how they might be able to go to market. A couple of other examples, one from a pharma company saying that they actually had very strong engagement in an online conference that they participated in. So they were quite pleased with the results that they were getting from that. One global executive was somewhat surprised by the level of engagement that they got from physicians using social media that is not typically perceived as perhaps the natural area of engagement for healthcare companies, but actually that seems to have worked fairly well from their perspective. And we also had spoken to one company which was really thinking more strategically about this. So their feedback, and this takes us into the next section of our conversation, which is, besides the improvisation we had to do with COVID, what does the future look like? How can we be strategic about it? Their feedback was that you could do too many experiments. And if you're not coordinating, if you're not extracting best practices, if you're not thinking about this in a strategic framework, you probably are not going to get the efficiency and the learnings that you need in order to scale this in a much more sustainable way. So this, I think, takes us well into our next conversation and our first polling question.
Mm-hmm. So as you can see, you're gonna see you should all be looking at the first polling questions I mentioned at the beginning of the call. In this case, we want to understand which of the approaches for digital stakeholder engagement have you used in 2020, and you can select one of the 4 options that you see on the screen by clicking on one of them. So webinar, select all that apply. So you have webinars, virtual conferences, virtual sales visits, or virtual technical trainings and product demonstrations. So please select as many as you think will apply to you.
And we'll see the results right away. So we will share this with everybody afterwards, so you have a copy of these. But also, I think we can comment on them as we go through the conversation.
Absolutely.
The answers will be anonymized, so any information you share with us will not be shared further in terms of anything other than aggregates. Okay, so not surprisingly, we have seen a very substantial introduction of webinars pretty much across the board. Lots of engagement with virtual conferences, sales visits. Basically, it seems like the participants on the line have been doing all of the above across a number of markets in LATAM in trying to bring their stakeholders a little bit closer to home. So this takes us into the conversation then of how do we build this more strategically into the overall business structure, and where do we go from here, having made all of those experiments? Some of the benchmarking data I'm about to show you, including this chart here, was based on benchmarking work that we did right before COVID. So this was late 2019 benchmarking, and a very substantial proportion of the respondents were LATAM based. And is here to give us a sense of how we went into this crisis. And of course, things have changed a little bit, but I think it points to some specific questions that a lot of companies are looking to address. So one of the things that we saw companies really struggling with before COVID-19 was going beyond experimenting, right? And really building a scalable structure and process around this. ROI, measuring ROI, is a big part of that, so that you can really be allocating your resources more efficiently. But what I think is interesting here is that it's unlikely that the experimentation created by COVID resulted in more structured strategies. More likely resulted in more experimentation, a lot more experimentation, which is great because it gives us a foundation on which we can now reflect back and understand what should be the right components of this strategy and how do we make it something that is sustainable and strategic, as opposed to operational and improvisational. But without a doubt, we would have seen significantly more experimentation coming into this. And as we think about the new normal, we're rapidly moving in that direction, especially as we think about second half of 2021 and certainly into 2022. We will land somewhere in the middle between the very unique situation that COVID-19 created, with a very drastic shift towards digital engagement tools, but certainly probably not land into where we were in terms of the old normal that we had. So with that said, I'd like to ask one more polling question for the group, which is really to understand how you're thinking about resource allocation. So as you think about post-COVID, 2021, maybe 2022, what is your best estimate for how much marketing spend will be dedicated to digital marketing and outreach? So some of those webinars that you mentioned you're all doing, some of those virtual conferences, how much, very, very roughly, do you think of your marketing budget will be dedicated to those digital tools? We'll give everybody just a minute to answer the question. Okay. Let's take a look at the results. Interesting. So this is actually quite a substantial allocation, and I'm going to take a guess here from the group, since I can't speak to all of you, that this is probably an increase relative to what the allocation looked like before COVID-19, at least a little bit. But also important for all of you to remember, what you're seeing in these results is what everybody else is doing. And so this also means that any content that we create, any new investment that goes into it, is certainly going to be going into a very competitive space, given the shift that we're seeing towards allocating more support for those types of engagement points. And so the next question for us really is, how do we make the most out of that investment in a landscape in which our stakeholders are going to be bombarded with more and potentially higher quality digital engagement tools, digital engagement materials, marketing, webinars, etc. And some of that starts with segmenting and really understanding where you're getting the biggest return on investment, thinking through who are the right stakeholders to engage with, what are the right channels to engage them with, and those might be changing over time, and certainly country by country, and what is the right type of content that is most likely to resonate with them. So really fine-tuning these strategies, especially if those stakeholders are likely to be seeing very large volumes of digital content coming their way. And then, of course, all of this needs to be calibrated based on return on investment, based on concrete results of what's actually working and what's not. And the reason I'm highlighting this is because measuring ROI is going to be a key component of how we actually get to a more sustainable approach to this strategy. And so for the rest of the discussion, we'll cover 4 components of this question that I think will help us understand where we can take this next. First, we should talk about customer journeys and stakeholder journeys so that we understand who they are and what that might mean in terms of your priorities from a digital engagement perspective. Then we'll share some data. We'll do some benchmarking around the actual tools the companies are looking to use right now for some reflection across the room. We will talk about ROI, very important for making sure that funding for these can be sustainable, and also you're spending your resources in the most efficient way. And we should talk a little bit about talent, because the people side of this as well is going to be important as we approach it from a more sustainable long-term way. So starting first with a question around the customer journey. So the most important question is, what do the stakeholders want? How do they want to engage? And the truth is that even if you had data on this from before COVID, their perceptions may have changed. And in fact, you may also have seen changes in terms of stakeholder needs and preferences between March, April 2020 and now. It may be March, April 2021, just because of how the crisis itself has unfolded. Before COVID-19, we did ask questions around how companies collected data around their stakeholder needs and preferences to inform their digital marketing strategy. And they were getting this data from some level of focus groups in interviews. Here on the left-hand side, you can see general observation was a really big component as well. So this is what you're hearing from the sales team, from the distributors on the ground, other stakeholders, but not necessarily structured or systematically measured over time, as well as some additional data sources, third-party providers, etc. So there was some information collection. A lot of it is qualitative, and some of these things are not necessarily easily repeatable over time, so that you can actually track not only what the needs are now, but how they evolve. This is very important because new digital tools come into the market quickly, and as we're seeing quite a lot of innovation going into this space, it's likely that there's going to be a lot changing in terms of what your stakeholders are experiencing. So part of the learning, I think, from this page in these results is the importance of being able to create a repeatable process that helps you track these over time and segment over time as well. We wanted to understand what information companies feel that they're missing as well. So where do you feel like you're not actually getting the information that you need? And it was on pretty important questions, such as how do the stakeholders actually use the information that we're sharing with them? So that's a really big data gap, because if you don't know this, you can't measure ROI. And similarly, what are the information gaps? That has direct implications for what content you create. So whatever information they're collecting from their observations isn't actually helping to answer these critical questions, which of course makes it very difficult to assess, are we creating content for the sake of creating content, or are we actually doing it in a way that helps us get to the results that we need to get to? And this is where those structures of consistent data gathering, very consistent approach towards getting information from stakeholders, and then measuring those over time against results is really critical.
Absolutely. And I think perhaps, Martina, this is a perfect opportunity to hear back from the audience. So perhaps we can go to the next polling question.
Yeah, let's do that.
Great. So the question is, how does your organization plan to get information on how digital engagement fits into customer journeys in the next 12 months? And here you will have the option to select one of the answers. Just give it a few moments here. And perhaps I can take this opportunity, Martina, while our audience is answering this polling question, to remind them that if at some point through this session they have questions or comments for us, please send them to us via the chat option on your right side of your screen. We will receive them and we will try our best to answer them through our Q&A session. Okay. Shall we look at the answers?
Let's look at the answers.
Huh.
So it seems like there is a substantial group of companies on the line who are looking to conduct dedicated customer journey mapping. A very, very justified decision based on what we've shared so far. And so hopefully you're going to get the results that you're looking to get. And then another 20% or so looking to have questions to broader customer journeys as well. Another good way of getting that information. So it seems like a lot of companies are on the right track here. If you are thinking about maybe doing this, it seems like consensus is moving in the direction of it's a worthwhile investment, especially because now what we also find is that it's really hard to anticipate behaviors given how COVID-19 has changed so much in the context in which stakeholders operate. And so if you don't ask them, they may not have any way of telling you what they think they're going to do or what their preference in the future is going to look like. And this changes over time. And so we would certainly recommend not only doing this customer journey mapping, but having a component of it that can be repeated over time, even if it's not the entire exercise, so that you can track changes. In particular, as we see, hopefully, some of the disruption from COVID-19 starting to wear away, and where you're seeing potentially some stakeholders coming back to old habits faster versus others. And maybe they start behaving in ways that even they didn't anticipate they were going to behave. And so all of these things would be great in terms of gathering fast-moving data, really pushing us a little bit into the world of how consumer companies might be looking at tracking some of their key customers as well. Now, we have a couple more polling questions to follow up on this one. And so we will, I think, skip to the next one now. And we will then wrap up and look at some of these all together with their implications. So of course, we also think that there are differences in terms of stakeholders across markets. We haven't put the full LATAM list of countries here, but just the top 5 to get a sense of which of these do you think stakeholders have the biggest openness to digital engagement tools? Because one thing we've seen is companies using doing experiments in certain locations and then scaling them. And where the openness is highest, you might also be able to run larger scale experiments, as well as learnings of what that might look like in less sophisticated markets. So would love your perspective on where you think that the stakeholder openness to these tools has been highest, in particular over the past year. Let's give it just 1 second. Okay.
Here we have them.
Are you surprised by these results, Marcia?
Not at all, Martina. I'm not surprised at all. It's exactly what I've been hearing from our clients. So, what do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are interesting results. We know that Brazil has been um, very sophisticated in a number of different ways, and we also know that companies have been using it as a test site, in some cases as an emerging markets test site for certain types of digital strategies. And so Brazil as a place of really pushing the more cutting edge approaches, given the scale that the market presents as well, and given the opportunity to potentially capture a bigger market, is definitely an interesting one. So that combination is a good combination in terms of having the scale of that market and also being able to capture more open stakeholders in terms of engagement. And then we have one more question for the group before we go back to the presentation for a minute. And this one is around what you think you might be doing more of from a digital perspective after COVID-19. So in particular, where you see very significant shifts in terms of the offline-online mix in your stakeholder engagement tools for the region. Do you think you would be doing 50% or more digitally, any of the areas presented here, from webinars to stakeholders to trainings to different types of sales engagements? Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so it seems like webinars and presentations are here to stay in a pretty consistent way. And interestingly, sales meetings with existing clients. And this one is very consistent with what we heard when we asked this question with Asia as well. And clearly, there is an element of convenience in terms of stakeholders with whom your teams have very strong relationships, very solid ongoing engagement, making that additional engagement online easier in a way, but definitely not as much of a shift. And when it comes to creating new business, engaging with new stakeholders, building relationships of trust, much, much harder to do online, more likely to remain largely offline than other areas. But it sounds like there's going to be an onslaught of webinars and presentations out there, even after COVID-19. And so this goes back to the question of how important it is to differentiate content. And if we can go back to the presentation, I think it's worthwhile for us to come back to some of the questions around the key areas in terms of engagement. In particular, as a reminder for the group around the importance of selecting your stakeholders, thinking about the right channels, and looking at the right types of content to go to them with, especially if they're going to be flooded with lots and lots of online content, which would be taking up a lot of their attention. You would be competing for their attention much more than you might have been even at the beginning of the COVID period. And so thinking about what we've seen companies investing before COVID-19, it sounds from this discussion that there has been some reallocation of priorities. So previously, some of the investment in terms of digital marketing was assigned to basic information sharing. So corporate website, some email campaigns and newsletters, some social media engagement, but a lot of it was around information sharing. Webinars are a different type of engagement tool. And as we're having one right now, you can see that there are ways to use them to have more of a back and forth with the audience as well, which is a different level of depth of engagement than some of the more passive approaches to which we have seen marketing money being allocated. So with that, I think it's important for us to also come back to the question about return on investment and how we think about measuring that. And in particular, thinking about how companies can integrate these questions of differentiation, identifying and positioning the content for the specific stakeholder needs and preferences, and choosing the right channel, but really understanding, is it actually working or not? Because if it's not working, then the resources are not necessarily well invested. Before COVID-19, we asked the group that we polled whether they measure return on investment on their digital marketing initiatives. As you can see, half of the group said, not really, we don't. I imagine that this has changed a little bit as a result of COVID-19. But as you can see, even the ones that were measuring it were potentially capturing it in general marketing return on investment analysis, not necessarily breaking it off separately from offline marketing, or were measuring it against engagement targets, but struggling to link those engagement targets to actual commercial targets. So how do you prove that this is actually working? And when we looked at where it is hardest to measure ROI, we were focused a little bit more on passive as opposed to active engagement. So we don't have webinars here, but we did look at a range of different tools. And as you can see, a number of areas came out as challenging in terms of areas of engagement and areas of measuring ROI. Social media is a big open question mark, very hard to understand whether engagement translates into something that is valuable for the business commercially and long term. And even some of the areas of investment, such as the corporate website, it was unclear to a lot of executives that we polled whether that's really generating the kind of intended investment results or not. And in terms of stakeholders, for which was it hardest to measure digital marketing ROI, very challenging to understand the impact on patients, but also importantly, very hard to measure the ROI of digital marketing for physicians. This, I think, is relevant to our conversation today, given that so much of some of that additional engagement has been shifted towards engaging with physicians. And so as you're building some of this innovation, as you're allocating more resources based on the results of what we saw in the polling results, really important to make sure that you're looking for the right ways and metrics to measure this, if so much of that engagement is actually going to be going towards physicians. And I think quite understandably, public payer is very difficult as well to understand what ROI looks like. And of course, uniquely challenging in the healthcare context. But again, how do we prove that this is working beyond generating activity? Quite a big open question. So we've looked at small experiments of what we've seen companies doing. Both of these examples are from LATAM. This one is a company which launched a digital awareness campaign. And what they really wanted to do is at least link some level of engagement to whether they're able to demonstrate growth in one therapeutic area that they decided to focus on in terms of their awareness campaign. They were able to see growth in terms of that area 12 months after the launch of that awareness campaign, and they were able to use that to make the case for additional funding using similar campaigns. They weren't able to prove direct one-to-one relationship with some of the commercial results, but there was sufficient correlation there that they felt confident that there is return on that investment. So it's not an exact science, and it's going to be really hard always to make this as precise as possible. Another one has been a company we spoke with, which actually did more of an experimental approach. So they launched an awareness campaign in a city in Mexico. And what they wanted to do is use a small scale experiment to see whether this can be scaled and frankly make mistakes on a smaller scale as well. And so what they were able to do is demonstrate 6% higher growth in León against other key markets in Mexico. And then following that, they essentially took that nationally and expanded it to other parts of the country. So clearly things that companies are doing to try and make this a little bit more specific, a little bit more tied to commercial results, are areas that we're expecting to see much more activity in. So with that, I'd like to ask a question of the group, which is specifically focused on ROI. And it's just to get a feel from the group today, especially in the COVID world, thinking about the investments you've made this year in your digital marketing. do you measure and define ROI? And if so, how? How specific is it? Is it measured against general marketing ROI? Is it against specific engagement metrics? Is it around in relation to sales, actually more directly linked? Or do you have a sophisticated way of measuring ROI that includes short and long-term metrics? Which one best represents your current situation? Okay, so I think we can give it a minute, and then it would be interesting to see the results. Perfect. So it seems like, not surprisingly, a good chunk of the group is measuring against engagement metrics. That is understandable. That does seem to be more the mainstream approach in terms of being able to prove that at least it is engaging someone and that it is working, especially given how quickly we've had to pivot around COVID-19. Still, actually, almost a quarter of the group not measuring ROI. So probably time to think about and work with your teams about even very simple ways of capturing that and building it into your marketing strategies for next year, especially as we go into budgeting and planning now. And there's really a small percentage, about 17% of the group, who are actually doing it in relation to direct and indirect sales. We don't have the ability to engage in dialogue right now, but clearly it can be done. And so we'll investigate a little bit of what does that look like in terms of best practices. But certainly, I think a call to action in terms of refining and making those approaches a little bit more sophisticated. And then the final topic, if we go back to the presentation, is really around talent. And talent is linked to the way that we staff the strategy. So earlier, we had a quote from one global executive who was talking about, let's not do this in a disjointed way locally, where different teams are trying different things, they're not talking to each other, and it's just experimentation based. Those experiments are really critical because they are the source of innovation for us, but we need to create a structure around it. And the structure around it has talent and people implications as well. In particular, if we think that digital marketing is going to be a more important way through which we engage with stakeholders in the future, especially in large markets. And it seems like Brazil, for example, is a good candidate here. So from a talent perspective, one thing that we asked our clients when we polled them before COVID-19 was how much of that they're actually doing in-house versus how much of it is contract work. So step one is, do you want to outsource this? That may be a fine strategy. But we are starting to hear, at least anecdotally, more and more of an interest in terms of bringing this a little bit more in-house, potentially with slightly more senior hires, and having somebody who is responsible for this as the most structured strategy, as opposed to a side job for somebody who's actually doing something else. And as you can see, quite a lot of the content creation was still not being done in-house, even though we know that their expertise within the organization in the unique ways in which healthcare information needs to be communicated really resides within the organization. We've also had conversations with clients about the right talent approach. Is it better to bring somebody in with very strong digital skills and train them on the field? Or is it better to have somebody who really understands the therapy area, the specific priorities and stakeholders of the business, and train them on digital tools? It seems like a lot more companies are really trying to upskill their internal staff than they are trying to bring in staff externally, just given the nature of the industry as well. But that is anecdotal. So as a last polling question for our group today, I wanted to ask you how you're thinking about your talent strategy over the next 12 months to support your digital stakeholder engagement strategy in LATAM. Are you planning maybe no additional investments? You'll be working with the staff that you currently have. Are you thinking about maybe reallocating staff towards content creation specifically? Are you looking to maybe get better data and analytics management? Maybe bringing a talent from another region to bring best practices, but from within your organization? Are you thinking about hiring senior staff, you can answer as many as you think are appropriate to your business. But let's see what kind of people investment is really being put behind some of the strategies that we saw earlier.
Thank you, Martin. And I think while everyone answers, I think it has been extremely interesting to really understand those key questions, but not only the questions, but really some of the insights to answer each of those. I think it's extremely relevant, particularly when how our clients are thinking about building that digital strategy. So I'm very curious to see the answers for this specific polling question.
Interesting. Actually, quite a lot of investment, it seems like it. So interestingly, quite a lot of investment in analytics management. That sounds like a very sound strategy, because if you're looking to create more specific ROI investment, if you're trying to actually be able to quantify a little bit more around engagement and approaches, in many cases, those resources are not always allocated there. So that seems to be definitely an interesting approach. And actually, a good quarter of the group is also looking to hire more senior staff. So what that tells us is it probably is in support of trying to build a more sophisticated structure strategy for digital stakeholder engagement, having somebody to own it who is not just operational, but really can be a partner to the commercial organization, to the government affairs organization, to the market access organization, and can really understand how to partner with them on their objectives, as opposed to maybe more focused on just generating content for the sake of generating content. But content creation is also going to be getting quite a lot of investment. And so it seems like some of the individuals on the line, at least, are looking to really beef up their people investments. Now, again, I think what you're seeing here is patterns that are quite consistent across the group of 50 or so people who are on the line right now. And that is also probably a signal of just how much more competitive the space is going to get in terms of what companies are investing in and creating as a result of their changes that they have experienced through COVID-19. So with this, I would like to wrap up with just a couple of key takeaways. And I think that there's some questions on the line that we can take before we wrap up the discussion. But to summarize, we do expect to see that digital stakeholder engagement will continue to shape the region, but it is a bit of a work in progress in terms of what is the right mix of online and online engagement. Not all stakeholders want to be engaging online. Some hate it and they really want to meet in person. There's a range of factors that might shift what that balance looks like in different geographies, different types of stakeholders. And so really understanding the data on stakeholder needs and preferences, segmenting those stakeholders, and then mapping the right tools and content types to engage with them is going to be critical. What we're seeing from the polling data is that substantial amount of money is actually getting directed in this area. Some of that is supported by staffing as well as funding, and that there are going to be clear increases permanently in certain types of digital engagement in the marketplace, in particular in terms of certain types of one-to-many type of communication tools. With that, I hope you have gotten a sense of where you might be relative to some of your peers across the LATAM region, and would love to open it for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Martina. It sounds that the companies are facing a lot of complexity and a lot of variables taken into consideration when identifying those opportunities in the digital world and building the strategies. So let's see. I'm looking at some of the questions. I know we're almost at the top of the hour, so we'll probably only have time for one question. But for those questions that we didn't answer today, we will follow up with you individually. So let's see, here we have the first one. Do you see companies training internal talent into digital tools or hiring digital talent and training them on healthcare?
Yes, so we spoke a little bit about this one, but basically we expect the pattern is strongly moving towards using internal staff in terms of the content creation in particular, and then potentially hiring people from the outside, either in a more strategic role, but they need to have some level of experience in the healthcare space for things like analytics, For example, hiring externally is often fine as well because data is data as long as you know what to do with it. But where it comes to content creation, there really is a heavier emphasis on training and upskilling internal staff rather than trying to hire from the outside. That seems to be how that shift is happening, just based on what we're hearing from the companies that we speak with.
Excellent. I don't think we have time for another question, correct?
I think we can take one more before we
okay,
I think we can take one more before we drop it.
Let's take another one. So another one that I have here is what about markets? Which are managed largely by distributors? How do we think about our strategies and options in markets where we are indirect?
Yes, a tricky question because not all distributors have had the ability to pivot as quickly as some of the multinationals have been, where they have local staff on the ground. And often companies are indirect in markets that are smaller and potentially less digitally sophisticated as well. But this has been a bit of a tricky point for some of the companies we've spoken with, because you need to get the buy-in from the partner. You need to figure out who within the partner has even the skills to do this. And you need to make sure that there's some level of quality control as well. So generally, we've seen companies really trying to do this more themselves as much as possible, and maybe having the partners be focused on fulfillment or other aspects of the relationship with stakeholders. But the multinational really tries more to control the messaging, even if that wasn't the situation before COVID-19. And also because multinationals can actually rapidly allocate a lot more resources, whereas distributors in some cases have had liquidity issues, they've had issues with non-payments, and so for them to be able to hire staff, train them, and get them going on this, especially if they haven't been really engaging in it before, very, very hard. So that's where we see multinationals mostly try to take on more of that burden in the short term, even if they think over time they actually want to upskill the partner and they want the partner to represent them in this way. It's been mostly done in-house.
Absolutely. Thank you. Tricky question, like you said, right? Okay, so with that, we are concluding the session today. Martina, I want to thank you so much for the presentation. For those on the line, I know we received a few other questions to mention. We will get back to you. We will also be sharing these recordings so that you have it available. And if you do have any additional questions after you receive it, please let us know, and we'll connect with you through our client services managers. Additionally, I want to remind you that we will have our next webinar, The Future of Telehealth in Latin America and How to Structure its Financing, on December 10th. I hope you all can join us. We will be sending out the details to connect over the next few days. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day. We'll talk to you. We hope to stay connected. Have a nice day.